Welcome to Taking Note episode 16. I am Eddie Meneses. Today is July 17th, 2020. I just have a few pickup notes here while we wait for everyone to tune in. I am on day one of a 3-day meditation retreat, a virtual meditation retreat. It's through the Mountain Cloud Zen Center, which is run by Henry Schuckman. And so I've been up since 5 a.m. with a few hour-long breaks here and there and a nap around 1 o'clock, basically either sitting or walking meditation all day. And it's been pretty incredible. A lot comes up in that time, and I'm definitely really looking forward to see what unfolds over the next 2 days. I think it's going to be a very enlightening, excuse the pun, experience. It's going to be a wonderful experience, I think. I'm really enjoying it so far. I found out about Henry Schuckman through Sam Harris's app, Waking Up. It's a meditation app. On that app, Sam and Henry have a 2-hour conversation, a little over 2 hours, really wonderful conversation. And Henry has a little mini series of meditations called The Introduction to Zen Koan. And I went through that little introductory series, really enjoyed it, looked him up, and they happened to be having a quarterly 3-day retreat, virtual retreat online. So I signed up and here we are. If any of you are interested in meditation, send me a private message and I will send you a link to a free month of the Waking Up app with Sam Harris. It's a really great app. I really love Sam Harris. And at the end of that trial, if you cannot afford to pay for a subscription, I believe it's $15 a month or about $100 a year. If you can't afford it, all you have to do is write support@wakingup.com and they will give you a free membership. Sam is really doing this for all the right reasons. He doesn't want financial hardship to be the reason why anyone doesn't pursue bettering their mind. I am not getting any kickback for promoting this app. I don't get a free month for every person who subscribes. I'm just doing it because I think I really appreciate Sam. I really appreciate everything I've learned from him, and I think everyone who tries it will really like it. So yeah, send me a private message. I will send you a free link to that. Let me know. This interview is unofficially brought to you by True Classic Tees. If you go to trueclassictees.com/Eddie-Meneses, you can get 15% off by using the discount code Taking Note. I wear these shirts every week. I'm wearing one right now. This is basically my uniform right now during quarantine. I either wear a black or a charcoal gray V-neck or crew neck shirt, dark jeans, and dark shorts, and they're all, not all, just the shirts are by True Classic Tees. Super comfortable, super soft. They fit really well. They cut a good silhouette. They show off what needs showing off, and they hide things that you might want to hide or not, but they hide things that I would like to hide, and I appreciate them for that. So yeah, get 15% off with the code Taking Note at trueclassictees.com. What else? Oh, as always, like, comment, and share. I reached a milestone this last week. As you know, last week I interviewed Alex Acuna, and that video now has over 1,000 views. That's my first interview to reach over 1,000 views. It has gone up every week. I think my first interview I had like 130 views, and from then it has gone up and up and up, and now I'm over 1K, and that is because of all my fans out there and the viewers who are sharing these videos. I really appreciate you. Thank you so much. Keep it going. Hit that share button. Tell your friends about it. And on that note, I put the entire archive on YouTube. I created a YouTube channel. I'm going to post that link now in the comments. Please subscribe to that, or tell friends who aren't on Facebook about this and ask them to subscribe to my YouTube channel. One day I will broadcast live to both of these platforms, but for now I'm going to broadcast to Facebook Live, and then a couple days later upload that episode to the YouTube channel. It's a work in progress. I have no idea how YouTube works. It's very confusing, but I'm going to keep going with it. Just like I was going with this. I knew nothing when I started this, and I've learned so much, and I'm sure I'll do the same with YouTube. So click that link and yeah, tell your friends. I had friends who aren't on Facebook and they wanted to watch the shows, so I put them up on YouTube. So yeah, like, comment, share. Anytime during this discussion, if you have a comment or a question, please put it in the comments below. We will get to it at some point. This is going to be a really great interview. I'm sure everyone's going to have lots of questions. I hope to see lots of questions from my guest today. And speaking of that, I will introduce her now. She is a rising star in the percussion and timpani world. She's in the early years of her professional career, but has already accomplished so much. She studied at Arizona State University and then transferred to Indiana University, where she finished her bachelor's degree and completed her master's, then became a very in-demand freelancer around Indiana, playing with groups all over the state, including the Indianapolis Symphony Orchestra, also while holding down 2 principal timpani jobs in smaller regional orchestras. And most recently, she won the principal timpani job of the Tucson Symphony Orchestra, making her the only Black female timpanist in the country in a professional orchestra. And she is also newly appointed adjunct professor of percussion at the University of Arizona. It is my absolute pleasure to bring you Alana Wiesing. Alana, thank you so much for being here.
Hi, Eddie. Thank you so much for having me. That was a lovely introduction, and I'm really excited to be here and be talking to you today.
Thanks. Me too. So glad you're here. So let's just go kind of with your origin story here. I heard an interview and I also read a short interview online. You started piano at age 5, correct?
That's
And
correct.
you played that for a couple years, decided you didn't want to practice it anymore, but then decided to
Right.
start playing percussion. So having stepped away from music, saying, I don't want to practice, what drew you to percussion in the first place?
It was kind of a whim, actually. There were a couple of months there between the time that I had ended my piano lessons and when I first started taking drum set lessons that my mom could see that I was really creative and really enjoyed playing music and was thriving and even doing better in school because of my involvement in music. So she really wanted me to continue, saw the benefit of me playing. And so she just kept asking me intermittently through that time, like, I think you should pursue another instrument. Is there something else that you're interested in playing? And so I grew up listening to a lot of classic rock around the house. It's like a
Mhm.
lot of what my parents listened to. And so I listened to a ton of Led Zeppelin. John Bonham is still like my favorite rock drummer of all time.
As he
And
should
a lot
be.
of other
Yeah.
classic rock bands. And so I was really drawn to the drum set and just on a whim, I was like, you know what? I think I want to try and do this. And my mom found me a female drum instructor who
Hmm.
had recently moved to Phoenix after finishing a degree at Berkeley in
Okay.
Boston. And that was amazing that I got to have that experience and study with a woman fresh out of school in that field. It was really, really cool. I took those lessons for about 4 years, and there was just a little bit of a period in there that overlapped with when I started taking orchestral percussion lessons, which
Hmm.
obviously ended up winning over in the end.
Did having a female drum teacher, like right off the bat as your first teacher, did that kind of solidify a love for percussion? Just kind of seeing yourself represented like that, seeing that there are female drummers.
Yeah, I thought it was incredibly empowering and inspirational to see someone who was also a woman who was in the field and such a great teacher and really laid the foundation for how to read percussion music for me.
Mhm.
It was incredibly inspiring and motivational. And it's pretty difficult for me to say at this point if that was really something that could have been a turning point or if I had had a male instructor that early, if it would have dissuaded me. It's really hard to say, but I can definitely say with complete confidence that it was very empowering and very helpful to have someone that I could relate to in that way to teach me.
Hmm. Yeah, I imagine. And so we'll skip ahead to university. You go to major in music. You start at Arizona State, and then you transfer to IU. What inspired you to transfer? What was it about IU that drew you there, or what was it about ASU that caused you to leave?
So there were a couple of different factors that played into that decision. Most of it, honestly, at the start when I was considering schools to apply to for undergrad, unfortunately, a lot of that consideration ended up being financial. Um, I had to really be careful about which schools that I decided to apply to for undergrad because my family and I were strapped for money at that point in time. This was right after the recession. This was
Hmm.
spring 2010, and so not too far off of the recession of 2007, 2008. And so I really had to be careful about which schools that I chose because we could only afford to buy so many plane tickets. And I'm flying across the country, wanting to primarily attend East Coast institutions. And so I was able to audition for 2 schools in one weekend, and then auditioned for another school another weekend, and then auditioned in state at Arizona State. And Arizona State had offered me very generously a full tuition scholarship to attend. And at that juncture, that was a very significant factor for me in deciding where to attend. And so I ended up going to ASU. It was a great experience for 2 years. During those 2 years, in the winter, the Arizona Music Fest hosts a music festival in Scottsdale, which is a northern suburb of Phoenix.
Yeah, my wife actually did that festival a few years ago.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. And at that point in time, John Tafoya was the principal timpanist for that festival. And so whenever he came into town, I made sure to reach out to him and take private lessons from him. And he also presented a master class at Arizona State one of those years. And even earlier than that, I was first introduced to him because I had attended the inaugural Interlochen Percussion Institute in the summer of 2010, and Keith Aleo had brought him in as the timpani clinician for that week. And so I had a few different experiences working with him and really enjoyed it. And so that was a major impetus for me to transfer, because I knew from a relatively early enough age in my training, I'd say by freshman year, sophomore year range of high school, that I wanted to pursue orchestral percussion. And so Arizona State has definitely had more of a reputation at that time of being more of a contemporary music, solo literature, marimba heavy school, which is fantastic. And it's a great program, but it just wasn't the program that I felt would be best to suit what I wanted to do with my career. And I felt that given the experience that I had had with Professor Tafoya, that transferring to IU was definitely the right decision for me. And I'm very fortunate that I had that time at ASU, that they gave me that full ride for those 2 years to be able to work really hard and help me and my parents save that money, so that when I could transfer, that it would be something that could be more affordable for us. And I was really grateful that when I did transfer, I was offered a really good scholarship to attend IU. So it was honestly mostly a financial decision at the onset, but once I started working with Professor Tafoya, it was definitely a musical decision as well.
That's really great. Did you play a lot of marimba, I guess, growing up or in high school?
Not too much. I honestly didn't really start playing marimba until 8th or 9th grade. And it was something that I definitely still feel is my weak point as a percussionist, and something that I've spent the least amount of time on for sure. But I've always enjoyed the instrument and think that it's such a beautiful vessel for musicality in our field. But it's not something that I just invested that time and energy into, especially knowing that I wanted to be an orchestral percussionist. And more specifically, I determined I wanted to lean more towards timpani jobs as well. Thought it was important for me to keep my options open, but knew in my heart of hearts that I wanted a timpani job, and that marimba wouldn't be too important in achieving that goal. So
yeah, I can certainly relate about marimba being my weakest link. I know we talked briefly before the interview. I'm definitely trying to remedy that now during quarantine. Definitely playing a lot more marimba now.
Have the time.
When you have the time, I always told myself, I can't make excuses anymore, because I was super busy before quarantine, and I would be like, yeah, someday when I have time, I'm going to do this, this, and this. And, now I have tons of time, and I need to get cracking on those things. So marimba is number one. So let's go into the video you posted on Facebook a few weeks ago, in light of all the recent tragedies, George Floyd. I guess this was most recently, like right after George Floyd, before Elijah McClain and all those other people. And before all the other names started coming up, Breonna Taylor and all them. This was in light of the George Floyd protests. What inspired you to speak out then? It was such a brave act on your part. Speaking alone, just riffing in front of the camera is really moving. You talked about your experience. What inspired you to do then, in light of that tragedy.
Yeah, well, thank you for your kind words and also for taking the time to watch that video and speak highly of that video. It means a lot. I felt it was really important to speak out because I am very aware of my position in the industry at this point. I, to my knowledge, am the only female and African American principal timpanist in the country. And so to have that intersection of those minority groups in classical music, and even more so amplified in the percussion world, led me to finally have the confidence to say something. And these are issues that have been following me throughout not just my career as a musician, but things that I've been dealing with generally in my life. And so having considered all of that and been ruminating on all of these things, and then leading up to particularly the George Floyd incident, there had just been this growing tension and this growing need to really amplify those issues and those problems that are systemic and institutional. And as I kind of alluded to in talking about my experiences deciding where to go to school, financial, for these underserved and underrepresented communities as well, that because I have this position, that it is my responsibility to, not take something like this lightly at all, and to use that position for good and to positively amplify these issues and use my experiences as a vessel to help do that. Because for me, it's more important to amplify the greater whole, and the greater consciousness. Obviously, I'm thrilled to be speaking about my career and my personal experiences. At the end of the day, though, what's really the priority for me is giving voice to these systemic problems and having me specifically using my experiences and using my platform aid to the greater progression of these issues and do whatever I can personally to help advance them and expand the consciousness amongst not just everyone in the percussion community, but classical music at large. Mm-hmm. And I definitely felt that it would have been more irresponsible for me to not say anything, given how it impacted not just my career, but my life in general.
Right. I certainly want to drill down on those topics later on, the general issues, the broader issues. But I would like to hear a little bit more about your experience growing up. So can you talk about those personal experiences, maybe, your experience growing up in a mixed race household, seeing the world through those two lenses, and how those experiences impacted you in school in terms of maybe favoritism or lack of or favoritism towards others, or you not getting opportunities based on you being a woman and African American. Any of those experiences you'd like to share?
Sure. I think growing up in a biracial household, looking back, I'm incredibly grateful for that experience. And my parents have been exemplary role models and incredibly supportive of me in my career and just across the board for me personally. And they have really set a high bar for me, and have always been so supportive and so proud of me. And they've just been really wonderful role models for me to look up to first and foremost. The interesting thing for me is being biracial is that I have a more heightened awareness of the fact that I don't necessarily appear to be African American, but it is very much a part of my heritage. And I think part of the shock for me growing up was having these conversations with friends and peers, and just casually talking about heritage and things of that nature. And whenever it would come up and I would tell people that I was Black, some of the reactions I got were quite shocking. And things like, oh, but you don't look Black, or really, or things of that nature that would sort of invalidate that sense of my agency over that part of my identity. And I don't even realize if people, or they don't realize rather, if they know that they're coming across and unintentionally invalidating that for me. But it definitely came across that way, and that level of shock. Most of the time, thankfully, it didn't result in a change of treatment of them towards me, but sometimes it did. Sometimes when people would find that out about me, it would change their perspective, and it would change the way that they interacted with me. And sometimes people wouldn't even talk to me anymore, and noticeably treat me differently, which was very interesting. And so it came twofold. One, for me, it was just important to acknowledge that reality that I am more white appearing. And then the awareness of how that could potentially have people treating me differently if they knew any different. And so I always live with that sort of internal dialogue anytime I come across anyone at this point. And so that's how it impacted me more personally. Going through my training and my career so far, I'm really thankful to report that instances of racism have been minimal. I think part of that is because of the phenomenon that I had just described to you of being more white appearing and people not necessarily knowing that information. Obviously, that in and of itself, of course, is intrinsically problematic. But I think part of that is why I didn't face as much racial bias going through. A vast majority of any bias that I have received in my career has been on the basis of my gender, of being a woman in percussion more than anything else. Thankfully, also in this department, I can't report too many specific instances towards me where a teacher would treat me differently because of my gender or my race. I think part of that is because once I did play for people, and once I did tell them about my goals or my accomplishments, then they did start taking me more seriously on the basis of my musicianship, as opposed to what I look like. But I don't want to necessarily speak on behalf of other people who have been on the receiving end of these situations, unfortunately. It's definitely, their responsibility to, articulate these things in their own way, at their own comfort, at their own time. But without going into any specific detail, I have unfortunately heard stories from female colleagues and friends in this industry who have been treated differently by male teachers and male colleagues on the basis of their gender, and not being taken as seriously, or comments coming up that may have intentionally or unintentionally sort of sexualized their appearance. And it's really disheartening and really discouraging to hear those kinds of stories. And I'm really grateful that I never really experienced that too much. I'm really grateful with the primary teachers that I had through all of my training, that was never an issue. But I have heard those stories time and time again, and I definitely am a part of those targeted, marginalized groups, and am an ally and an advocate for those people who have experienced that treatment. And I'm working in every possible way that I can to make sure that that is no longer the case, that we are treated equally with just as much respect and consideration going forward in this field.
Do you think that change is already happening and maybe has been happening over the past few years, or do you think that sexism is just as rampant as it was, say, before and after the Me Too movement?
I definitely think there is, because of the Me Too movement, a heightened awareness for sure. And I think it plays out a couple of ways. I think it's operated in both extremes. I think people have tiptoed on eggshells maybe too much to a certain extent, And some people, the Me Too movement has had no impact on them whatsoever, and still everything in between as well. But I think it really has to come from a place of a more internal personal dialogue, because it requires a heightened awareness of our own internal, personal, conscious and subconscious biases, prejudices, than it is a sort of uniform band-aid over an issue. I think really it comes down to us on an individual level examining those things for ourselves and finding for ourselves individually how we can best acknowledge and address these issues. And if for any reason that we find ourselves drawn to treating any one particular individual any differently on any level, it's important to further ask ourselves those questions as to why and how we can best move forward from that and make sure that in an effort to correct those behaviors and address those behaviors, that it doesn't also come across as any sort of favoritism or overt different treatment in another extreme direction. I think it's just a topic that we have to continue having this conversation about and continually address. I don't think it's something that we can say, oh, well, I sat down with myself for a few days and asked myself some questions, and now I have all the answers. I think I've solved internal bias for myself forever. I don't think that that's how that's going to work at all. I think it's something that we have to continue to have in our consciousness, continue to be asking these questions, and those kinds of sensibilities and how we feel we can best address these issues should change and will change over time. So I think that it should be an ongoing conversation externally and internally.
For sure. And I know that while that is necessary work for people to do, it is oftentimes difficult to confront yourself, right, and your own beliefs, and to constantly question your beliefs. That
Absolutely.
is, something that should always be done. That's something I certainly do in my own life. For all of any beliefs I hold, I always put them under scrutiny to either find new beliefs or to strengthen my beliefs that I already have. But yeah, again, it is incredibly difficult. So how do we manage the problem of, say, a well-respected teacher who is from a bygone era, who maybe has some more anachronistic tendencies, who is resistant to change, not overtly, he's not resentful of change, just almost lacks an ability or lacks an understanding of how to change?
Right. I think again that conversation has to occur twofold. I think part of it is acknowledging from the person who is on the receiving end of this particular individual in question, not anyone specifically, but the kind of figure you're describing rather. I think it's important for anyone on the receiving end of those conversations to understand the perspective of that person as best as they can. That person, to a certain degree, is a product of their time and their environment and their experiences, just like any of us are. That's what's so difficult and also very interesting about this time, is that heightened awareness that all of us are shaped by a whole myriad of different factors, our homes, our financial situation, our race, our gender, our friends, our work environment, a whole slew of factors and things that I know I'll forget to mention that shape us into the people that we become and the people we continue to become. And so I think a great place to start is both people approaching that conversation to the best of their ability with some baseline understanding and awareness of that on either end and on any end. The person on the receiving end of the conversation, I think, might end up being too quick to judge the person with these views as well, and be very quick to, quote, cancel them. Not to say that cancel culture isn't entirely a bad thing, because I think there are, to a degree, certain behaviors that are that should be professionally unforgivable, most definitely.
Certainly.
But as much as we can, I think try and understand that other person's perspective as best as we can, and try to have calm, collected, mature, nuanced conversations, also with the understanding that we are going to screw up. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to say things and articulate things in a way that isn't completely reflective of our ideals or what we're aspiring to achieve, and lacking that sort of sensibility on the perfect way to articulate something. And so I think there has to be some element of forgiveness for people who are trying to learn and trying to improve versus people who clearly are not putting in that time and that energy to improve and try and learn. I think there's a really distinct difference between both kinds of individuals, and granting forgiveness to those who clearly evidence that they're trying is paramount, as opposed to grouping those people in with the others who clearly do not exhibit those same desires and that willingness to change and learn. From the perspective of the person who is from an earlier generation or someone who holds more bigoted views, this is really difficult because it's hard for me as someone who is a living, walking, breathing minority on every single level, to get into the head of someone like that. But what I will say is those people usually justify their behavior, or their thought patterns by saying something to the effect of, well, I've never had to address this before. This was never a problem before. Therefore, I don't see the reason to do anything any differently or change. And while part of that, I want to try and understand, I don't necessarily, but I try. Another part of me is like, well, this person is also just making excuses for how this behavior and these views might have been swept under the rug before, but now we are at a place where it is openly not acceptable and people are not tolerating it as much, if at all. And so I think both sides of this conversation need to address their own humanity first and foremost, address that we all come from different backgrounds. We are all flawed. We are all working, or at least I hope so, to try and continue to learn and improve. And that sort of respectful baseline place to start in a conversation, I think, is paramount. Otherwise, if we're so quick to cancel people or dismiss people, I don't think any work can be done. And these conversations have to occur at the individual level, or else we're not going to be able to see as effective collective change.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think you said something very wise about having an open dialogue, having a nuanced conversation about these issues, because I find just in my own observations that when someone does something and someone else is offended and they cancel them, it's usually done by shame, right? Public shaming of some sort. And sure, that person might be canceled and disappeared from the public sphere, but they're not gone. And they are probably brooding in resentment, and they're probably more steadfast in their views than they were before. So, I found that. I think that's really wonderful what you said. I think that is absolutely crucial to have these conversations, to try and see where the other person is coming from, even if you don't agree with them, and try and get on the same page or see eye to eye to facilitate change.
Absolutely.
I think that was very well said.
Yeah, there are two sides to every story. I mean, obviously there might be a side that, especially in these kinds of circumstances when we're dealing with these things, that can be overtly wrong, or overtly in the wrong in some sort of way. But I think it's important to at least attempt to have the conversation before we come to such quick, harsh, but also sometimes cruel and unnecessarily ostracization of these people. But I do think that a lot of it has to be a willingness for those people to take a step back and examine their own views and their beliefs and try to understand why people are criticizing their behavior or the things that they've done, and at least make that effort, because if that effort isn't made, then their cancellation is more justified and understandable.
Mm-hmm. I guess if we can go a little deeper on this topic, maybe we can talk about implicit bias and your thoughts on that. So, do you believe that everyone is biased in some way, and everyone should be kind of looking for that, or how would you respond to someone who says, like, I'm not biased, I'm not racist, I don't treat anyone different, I don't need to do this work?
Yeah, I do believe everyone is biased in some sort of way. And I think it's important to address, even just for me personally, that just because I am a member of these marginalized and targeted groups does not mean that by being a member of them that I am immune to any of that for how I view people and how I engage and interact with the world as well. I think we all are biased in some way, shape, or form. And it's really important to continue, like I said, to be addressing these things and have it be a consistent internal dialogue. So moving forward, it's just a critical thing to do.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I definitely agree with that. I certainly think, again, how you've talked about going too far in one direction. I certainly think that it's possible to go too far in this direction, but it is definitely, I think, crucial for everyone to kind of take a look inside and just explore, and don't necessarily shame yourself if you find something. Just acknowledge it and try to, I don't want to say fix it, but try and change it in some way.
No, absolutely. I think that's a huge problem with cancel culture too, is that sometimes people don't necessarily know that their behavior was, quote, wrong or actually explicitly wrong. And to shame people for not knowing the things that they didn't know is really difficult, and to some people it might be obvious. It might be, how could you not know that this was not acceptable? How could you not know that what you were doing was wrong or hurtful or discriminatory or any host of things? And again, I think it's important to at least make the attempt to have a nuanced conversation about it, because in some instances, yes, that line crossed is very explicit, very clear, and in other instances, it might not be. And so to have that open conversation, I think is really critical. And then everyone always be looking inward to evaluate those potential biases for themselves. And it's a noble cause. I definitely pride myself on being someone who does treat everyone as equally and with the same level of respect and consideration and consistency in how I interact with different people as possible. But it's not something that I can explicitly say happened, For me, it's an ideal. It's something that people are continuing to aspire to and something that we continue to grow and improve on over time. And so I try and view how I treat people in that way. I don't view it as a hard and fast, this is how I treat people, this is how I see people, kind of thing. I view it as an ideal that I'm continuing to aspire to, and something that is going to theoretically improve and I'm going to learn more and be better about over time.
Yeah. I just on the difficulty, like, the necessity of having nuanced, dispassionate discussion about very, topics that can be very charged at times, right? How would one, I guess, go about that? Because that certainly is not what we typically see, right? In the age of social media, everything is highly reactionary. You see these massive emotional, violent reactions to something, and there's very little nuanced, dispassionate discussion when someone is offended. It's almost like being offended in itself is enough to cancel someone, or commit, offending someone is enough to be canceled, and it's considered a crime. So how do we go about changing that culture?
I think it's really important to, if you or I or anyone were to see, a headline in the news, or to see a status that someone writes, or a Twitter update, whatever it might be, that could cause that kind of reaction, to literally just take 5 to 10 seconds and take a deep breath, reset, read it again, and really reevaluate. Because if it produces the same reaction at least 2 or 3 times, then I think it's worthy of engaging. But even when we do take those steps to engage, I think we need to try and approach situations and conversations a little bit differently, with a little more grace and compassion and patience. A lot of these kinds of conversations, it can be really easy to be fueled by rage, anger, frustration, all, especially in the light of the Black Lives Matter movement, are incredibly valid reactions, and certainly have been my reactions to all of the events that have been happening, not just over the past couple of months, but seeing this happen over the course of my lifetime. But I think it's really important to calmly and constructively attempt to engage in these conversations, as opposed to simply just responding in the heat of the moment and getting it out with a tone of anger and frustration. I think it's important to have as even-keeled and calm, yet still very impassioned delivery of your point of view, all while also being open to an opportunity for dialogue. Because I think a lot of the issue too is people put things out there, and they may say that they want feedback, or usually they don't. They just put things out there, period, end of discussion. These are my feelings, and have already closed themselves off out of the gate from even attempting to want to have a more nuanced conversation about these really difficult issues that should be more deeply discussed. And so I think, again, from both ends, it just requires not as much stubbornness from either side, and a deeper understanding of why people might have these views that they have. Why is someone reacting in this way? And also, there shouldn't be this added pressure to have a reaction for every action either. I think it's a real balance in deciding if you even want to engage at all. And then if you do want to engage, making sure that it is done in a very calm, collected, yet impassioned, articulate manner. Otherwise, it's just ultimately going to turn into a screaming match between both sides, where neither side is truly hearing the other, and ultimately nothing gets accomplished because of that discussion. And again, it is important, of course, in these instances, to know when something is explicitly crossing a line, and to hold true to your moral compass and values in instances where you do see that someone is spewing hate speech, or someone is being deliberately divisive, or someone is being explicitly biased or prejudiced in some ways. We do have to call those things out for what they are. Absolutely. But in these more difficult conversations and nuanced topics, I think it is really important to try and approach things with a more even-keeled, articulated perspective.
Yeah, very well said. Totally agree. Yeah, when I feel like, when you read something and it makes you angry, and you feel furious, obviously those emotions are valid, and you should acknowledge those emotions. But if you let those emotions make your decisions for you from that point on, then it seems to only fan the flames. And yeah,
Absolutely.
you're really spot on about that. Or I'm just in complete agreement with what you're saying. Let's bring it back to the orchestral world now. We've kind of done a deep dive. I just kind of want to circle back to, in the interview you did with Jeremy Epp a while ago, you mentioned that professional auditions were problematic, and he brought up the point for the DSO, the Detroit Symphony Orchestra. In their case, their auditions are completely blind all the way through, unless they go to a trial week, which obviously the person has to play with the orchestra and it's no longer blind. But in those auditions, they saw very little representation from women and Black or people of color in the final round. They had some representation, a very small amount of representation in the preliminary rounds, but once you get to the final rounds, even though it's screened the whole time, there were very few. And so for me, that tells me in my logic that the audition process itself on that day is fair, but that the lack of diversity we're seeing on stage is due to another underlying cause. And I'd like you to speak on that, if you would.
Yeah, I think you're right on the money there. I honestly think that orchestras trying to address that problem at that stage is important. It needs to continue to happen. The screen needs to continue to be in play. If not through until the final round, through the entirety of the process. But I think even addressing things at that stage, that lack of representation that's being talked about, it's problematic before the audition even comes into consideration. I think we need to do a better job of addressing the issue well before that stage. I think it starts in early education, truly, because by the time we start trying to address these issues at the professional level or at the auditioning level, and even at the collegiate level, it's already almost too late. Because if those people who have had the ability to decide that they want to pursue music as their career and their major in college and receive that additional training and pursue audition and professional opportunities, there are a series of experiences and circumstances likely that a person is expected to have by the time they start college. And the harsh and very sad and unfortunate reality of this is that people of color and other marginalized, underprivileged, underrepresented groups are at significant disadvantages systemically, institutionally, and financially, well before the really advanced stages of our training and making that leap and transition into the professional world. And so the real core issue, and something that I'm personally very passionate about and have been laying the groundwork and expanding as much as I can personally, even just in my community in Tucson, is giving back on a local level and to ages that are much younger. And so I'm a part of a program here in Tucson called Upbeat. And it's really neat because it's through the University of Arizona. It actually has nothing to do with my professor job, but it's a separate program, educational initiative through the University of Arizona, where it is an early music education and music reading, learning curriculum, but it's entirely through the percussion lens. And so we are teaching these kids hand drumming. We're teaching them how to read rhythms on percussion instruments. And it's a really neat way to not just expose these inner city kids to these programs and to percussion, but just music in general, just piquing their interest and getting them involved at much younger ages. Obviously, it's a whole separate conversation. I'm actually meeting with my colleagues next week to discuss how we're even going to move forward. And we're going to present that curriculum, whether that be in person, which is looking unlikely, and through visual mediums, virtual mediums, and then also dealing with the sanitation and the disinfection of various pieces of equipment and spacing and a whole myriad of issues that we're going to discuss. But I think that the work that program is doing and that I'm so honored to be a part of is so incredibly important. And it's a program that can be implemented into all K-8 schools in the community. And there have been a really good handful that have signed on. And it's also starting to expand up to the Phoenix area as well. And so it's starting to gain good traction in Arizona, and something that I'm really a part of. So I think those kinds of initiatives are really important, where we can hone in and get these kids having these experiences and that exposure to not just percussion, but music in general at much earlier ages. And there are other programs that the Tucson Symphony Orchestra does that incorporate a similar thing. They have a really wonderful young composers program. And as far as I know, it's the only one of its kind in the country, where these kids can sign up for this program. They go through a year-long, well, it's really in conjunction with the symphony season. So it runs from September to May, roughly, where they meet with different instructors once a week. They also have master classes. I presented one last year and present one every year that I'll be here, discussing timpani and how it works, its range, its function, how to write for the instrument, different examples of what we can do technically and musically. And they have these classes with a member of the orchestra across all instruments. And by the end of the year, they'll have composed 1 to 2 minute long pieces for symphony orchestra. And these kids are as young as 8th or 9th grade through high school, maybe even younger than that. And to have such an experience where they're learning about these different instruments and working with symphony members one-on-one, and to have that experience where they're learning about composition as well as just the different instruments in the orchestra in general is so invaluable and so incredible. And then that satisfaction of having their pieces played back to them by professional musicians, and them actually being able to see and hear, wow, this is something that I can actually do, and I created this, I think is such an incredible feeling. So I'm very grateful to be a part of this music community, because there are a lot of really wonderful things happening here. And I think that if local music communities can do a better job of, participating in or constructing these initiatives for the young people of their communities, I think that really gives not just underserved, underrepresented people, and especially people of color, Latinx communities, an opportunity to have that exposure, but it's exposure that is beneficial for everyone. It just happens to be of greater accessibility and benefit to those underserved communities, which is ultimately what we need to see. And the theory is by having that exposure at those younger ages, that will trickle up into the high school level, into the collegiate level, and into the professional level, because they will have had that accessibility and that stability, financially being able to afford these programs. And a lot of these kinds of programs, musicians have to donate their time and energy in order to make them happen for these kids. And I know it can certainly be conflicting for some people, because, we're taught when you want to pursue music, you're not expected to make a lot of money, but the goal is to have a very stable, successful, career in which you can financially support yourself. And so, to finally get to a place where you're able to do that for yourself, and then people are telling you, well, you need to donate your time and you need to donate your energy, it is kind of a letdown a little bit. But for me, I don't care.
Hmm.
For me, it's about paying it forward and really empowering the next generation of musicians and giving them access to opportunities that they wouldn't have necessarily had otherwise, because that could be their career. And they just don't know it, and they might not have known it had they not had access to those opportunities.
Hmm.
And it also might not be, but that's okay. Music definitely has a wide range of benefits, even if you decide not to pursue it for a career. I know for sure that there are so many skill sets that I have cultivated in being a musician that have applied across the board in my life. So these programs are really just a winning situation on every level for any group of people, but it's particularly beneficial for these underserved communities. And like I said, for me, I don't mind paying it forward. I don't
Hmm.
mind dedicating my time, because it could mean that that person can achieve goals and have that sense of confidence and belief in themselves, not just in terms of music, but just traversing through life that they might not have had otherwise.
Yeah, I think that's a really wonderful program and a wonderful idea. And I'm sure any work that you personally put into that is probably going to be paid back to you tenfold in some way. It seems incredibly rewarding. And on that topic, I certainly agree that the education, especially at an early age, is crucial to someone's success, because especially if they're going to play like a string instrument or something, you have to start young, and it's very expensive to have a violin and to have lessons, and so needs to be
Absolutely.
subsidized in some way, for someone to stand a chance at getting into Juilliard or whatever school they want to get into. And I guess on a side note, yeah, the whole donating your time and wanting to have a solid career, I think also, that kind of starving artist is really more of a mindset than anything. And it's really the mindset you put out there. The pie is plenty big enough for people to be successful in music, even if, maybe they wanted to be in a big orchestra, but they're not. They can still have a very rewarding career. So back to the education piece, in my interview with Garrett McQueen, he was talking about, like, certainly that's one aspect, getting instruments and quality training for underprivileged communities at a young age. But another point that he brought up was culturally relevant education. So while you may provide access to these underprivileged uh, uh, kids and communities, the education they might be getting are, European old dead white men, and they're not really relating to what they're being taught. Do you have any kind of ideas about the curriculum you would teach?
Yeah, I definitely agree with his points. Yeah, the reality of most public school music programs is through the lens of concert band, and learning a concert band instrument. And once you get into the professional world, there are so few people who are actually making a sustainable full-time living playing in a professional concert band, or playing in a professional symphony orchestra. And so while their work in the classroom is so valuable and so needed, and that level of support is incredibly important, it's definitely uh, not indicative of the kinds of jobs in music that you really see in the real world.
Mm-hmm.
And I definitely do believe that our music education curriculum should be better preparing its students for a very different and very diverse, ever consistently changing musical landscape. I don't necessarily have all of the answers, but it's definitely something that I've given some thought to and am really passionate about. I certainly, at least as it pertains to more orchestral percussion or even just percussion in general, I think drum set should be a much bigger point of emphasis in percussion curriculum,
Mm-hmm.
because so many gigs um, require good drum set skills, and a lot of freelancing opportunities, a lot of bands, a lot of recording work, a lot of studio work, a lot of different opportunities, even opportunities in concert bands require really solid drum set skills. And it's one of the most versatile instruments that we can play. You can find drum set in almost any genre of music. And I'm incredibly grateful that my percussion education started there, because it's something I still really highly prioritize and still make a part of my practice routine, and still go out and play. Obviously not as often now that I have a timpani job, and especially now given the current circumstances, but it's something that I still really cherish and think is really important. So I think at the very least on a percussion community level, that's the direction that our industry is headed. Another direction that our industry is headed is in programming and in electronic music. And it's definitely highly problematic. And I've been one of those people too, who's complained about, oh, well, a machine is taking all of our jobs, or what, we don't even need to be there if, these pre-programmed sounds. But that's really the reality of where most mainstream music is going right now. And University of Arizona, again, I'm so thrilled to be a part of such a progressive, great program, offers that kind of a course. To my recollection, we are the only school that has a completely electronic percussion ensemble. It's one of a kind, called Crosstalk. And in that course, our students learn about Ableton. They learn how to create sounds, how to program a mallet cat, how to program for triggers and pads. And every concert that they present at the end of the semester is all student created and curated content, and is all presented in real time, triggers in real time. And it's just really, really cool to see. And I think those kinds of skills are being prioritized and sought after more in this industry generally. I'm incredibly grateful to be in the position that I'm in, and that I was able to land the job that I really wanted. But had I not, I think the responsible thing to do is take into consideration the ever-changing landscape of music and try and adjust. But I also think it's important to chase your dreams as well, pursue what is going to make you happy and what brings you that level of fulfillment and joy. And I think that intersection of sort of passion and practicality is really important in this industry. So I don't know. I certainly don't have all of the answers, but I think that addressing the changing landscape and, not pretending that it isn't changing is not helpful. I think we have to acknowledge that reality and try to adjust and try and be teaching the kinds of music and the kinds of instruments that are going to be of most use and be most versatile for our students moving forward, so that when they do get out into real world situations and enter the professional world, that they will be equipped to handle those situations.
Yeah, or just create something for themselves. I think that's a really wonderful program. I so badly wish that existed when I was in college. I would have hopped on that in a minute. But I think there's room for both, right? There's room for both electronic and acoustic music, and there's room for the intersection of the two, the combination of the two. It's always, there's nothing like going and seeing live music and watch people perform, even if they're performing on electronic instruments. It is essentially like the computer is its own new style of instrument, and it can be really amazing to watch. And it is something that takes skill. Obviously, there are people who can compose, a pop tune by pressing a couple clicks or whatever, but rarely does that succeed. It does take nuance and skill to actually make something appealing with an electronic instrument, and especially to combine it with acoustic, which is even more appealing, I think, tenfold when you see people actually playing and combining the two. So that's an awesome Really awesome program. I'm excited to see what comes out of that. So
Yeah.
we've gone a little over. Thank you for going over time with me here. It's just been
Oh,
a
not a
really
problem.
wonderful conversation. I guess we can close with maybe your vision for the future, what you'd like to see in the future. I was listening to a Sam Harris podcast recently, and I realize this might sound bizarre of a white person talking about another white person's view on racism and a future outlook. But his goal was, I don't know if I can actually quote him here, but to live in a post-racial future where the color of someone's skin or their ethnicity is as much of a consideration as their hair color or eye color. And he uses the example like, can we name all the CEOs who are redheads in the country? And no, because we don't care if the CEOs are redhead or not. Is that a viable outlook to you? Is that something you would look forward to, or something else?
I think it's nice in concept and nice in ideal, but I think the greater issue that a lot of people of color, including myself, sort of see with an approach like that is a disregard of our history because of our skin color, and that level of reconciliation and that level of acknowledgement hasn't ever happened.
Hmm.
And great strides certainly have been made, but nothing close, to true quote equality that we really need to be seeing. And so to completely disregard that, I think, is incredibly irresponsible and dismissive of
Hmm.
our history and our struggles, and things that are still very real and very tangible for us. But the ideal is something that I definitely am on board with. I mean, it shouldn't be such a consideration and such a point of bias and discrimination moving forward. And I really hope that we can get to a place as a country where we can really delve into having these conversations, kind of like what I was saying earlier, making sure that they are more nuanced. They are, coming from a place where people can put their pride and ego and any preconceived notions aside and really just dive into these issues and, be able to acknowledge any lack of knowledge or ignorance that they may have in regards to that history or in regards to people of color, Latinx, other underprivileged, underserved communities might have, those kinds of experiences that they're not familiar with, have that willingness to be able to really open their ears and learn. And I think we can all learn from each other moving forward. And I think in order to really reach that ideal that you talked about, those conversations absolutely have to continue to happen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And certainly, I feel like the history does need to be acknowledged, and that is something that would be essential to achieving that in the future. Yeah, I
Mm-hmm.
certainly would not be on board with just dismissively saying it doesn't matter and dismissing someone's history like that. That's a good point.
Yeah.
Anything you'd like to plug or say before we sign off here?
I don't think so at the moment, but what I will say is that it's been absolutely amazing to have the opportunity to talk with you today, and thank you so much for having me on, and your willingness to talk with me and further discuss these issues is a testament to you and to your character and your humility in addressing these things. And it really does mean a lot having an opportunity to discuss these things with you like this.
Thank you so much, and that was certainly a really incredibly, for me, intellectually stimulating conversation. A lot of wise words were said on your part. I thoroughly enjoyed that, and thank you so much for being here today. And I will catch up with you in a second.
Sounds great.
All right, thanks, Alana. Wow, I mean, what a great conversation. That was definitely one for the books. I really enjoyed that conversation. Everything she said really, struck a chord with me. makes me want to dive deeper, makes me want to have more conversations with people, more conversations like that, where we can really address issues and solve problems potentially and hopefully. And I think Alana's completely right about needing to have these nuanced conversations in order to make progress. So with that, I guess I will sign off. I'm definitely going to watch this one back for sure and take notes. No pun intended. And I will be taking a break next week. I'm going to be helping my wife do a online recital with her and her former teacher for a master class they're doing. I'm going to be streaming it live to Facebook. I'll be live directing that. So I'll be back on July 31st with Mr. Joe Pereira, who is the principal timpanist of the Los Angeles Philharmonic. And I'm excited for that interview as well. Until then, be safe and bye for now.